president. He appeared to confuse the Chinese city of Beijing with the self-governing island of Taiwan. He confused Jimmy Connors, a famous tennis player, with Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I won't. This rant is not a singular event. Last January at a rally in Iowa, Mr. Trump incoherently stated, quote, "Think of it, magnets," end quote. And now all I know about magnets is this: give me a glass of water, let me drop it on the magnets, and that's the end of the magnets, end quote. During a series of March campaign rallies, Trump mistook the country of Argentina for a person, telling the crowd, quote, "You know, Argentina, great guy. He's a big Trump guy. He loves Trump. I love him because he loves Trump. Anybody that loves me, I like them," end quote. He also claimed that a poll was a legislative bill, and he called our country the United Stage. And he made a series of unintelligible noises when describing himself. Ding, boom, this is me, bing. It's not even clear if Trump knows which of his political opponents he's running against. Mr. Trump has mixed up President Joe Biden and former President Barack Obama on at least 8 different occasions. He bizarrely mixed up presidential candidate Nikki Haley with former Speaker Pelosi, inferring that Ambassador Haley was responsible for Capitol security. He can't keep straight the names of world leaders. In October of 2023, Mr. Trump referred to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban as the, quote, great leader of Turkey, end quote. Republicans are intellectually and morally dishonest to criticize President Biden when their dear chosen leader, Donald Trump, presents with symptoms which are quite frankly scary. The American people can see through this Republican charade. This is just an ugly exercise to hurt President Joe Biden. Let's move on. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I just wonder if the gentleman from the other side of the aisle is concerned that the additional aid that was voted on to go to Taiwan would cause that island to tip over in any point in the future.
You know what? I hope that
the
island of Guam is floating on water and not on diesel fuel. That's the point I was making.
Well,
and I think that the gentleman might question my mental acuity, but let's look at your dear leader. Let's look at
reclaiming my time.
Former President Trump. Let's look
at the gentleman from Kentucky.
Reclaiming my time. I have the utmost respect for my colleague on the other side of the aisle. The point I wanted to make is that sometimes we make statements tongue-in-cheek that we are metaphorically speaking, and that the president most certainly in most of those cases was doing that, as we all have, Republican and Democrat, made statements that if you're taken out of context seem indefensible or ungrounded, if you will. Let me give an example. So the comment on the magnets here, if you give me a glass of water, let me drop it on the magnets at the end of the magnets. I've actually heard the former president, talk about that. And what he's talking about are electromagnets. So there was a discussion about whether the catapults on aircraft carriers should be steam-driven or electromagnetically driven. And it is true that steam is more reliable, that water would not affect the hoses, for instance, but salt water could affect wires that are driving electromagnets. So I think it's disingenuous here to offer this and take many things out of context, to take things that were said tongue-in-cheek, to take things that were said on the campaign trail and act as if they were meant to be taken literally, because we all, on both sides of the aisle, have said things before that were not meant to be taken literally. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yield?
I'll yield, Chairman.
I think the gentleman for yielding. I think the point is well made. no human being's ever said everything exactly right. We've all made mistakes, whatever. But the fundamental question in front of us is, was the decision not to prosecute consistent with the Department of Justice's commitment to impartial justice? That's the fundamental question. President Trump is getting prosecuted for a classified documents concern. Joe Biden isn't. Biden isn't because, this is what the special counsel said. He said, Mr. Biden's memory appeared to have significant limitations, both at the time he spoke to his monitor in 2017 and as evidenced by their recorded conversations, and today as evidenced by the recorded interview with our office. That's why we want the audio tape. President Trump is the department being impartial. President Trump is getting prosecuted. We know what's going on in Miami. President Biden isn't, and he isn't because of that statement from the special counsel. That statement from the special counsel in light of the facts of the case. The elements of the crime have been met. Mr. Hur sat right at that table and told us Joe Biden knowingly kept classified information and knowingly disclosed classified information. Special counsel told us in his report why Joe Biden did it. He said he had strong motivations to release classified information because he was writing a book for which he got paid $8 million. So we have motive, we have the elements of the crime, but he doesn't get charged, and yet President Trump does. And so this committee, the committee that oversees the Justice Department, has oversight of the Justice Department, wants to know if they are impartially administering justice. And the best way for us to figure all that out is to get all the evidence that the special counsel had at his disposal so we can figure that out and see if there's something we need to do legislatively to change the special counsel statute. But it's all part of our oversight. That's the fundamental question. We can get into things people say. I've said things that, taken out of context, Mr. Massey has, Mr. Johnson has, we've all said it. So that's not the point. The point is that fundamental question. Was it the administration of impartial justice? Were they being consistent? That's what we want to know. I yield back. Thank you for yielding.
Yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Tiffany.
Yeah, and just to add on to the chairman's comments in regards to impartial, I mean, if you go back to the Senate confirmation hearing for this Attorney General, he said, I'm going to conduct justice without fear or favor. And he's getting a chance now to live up to those words. Will he provide impartial justice without fear or favor to the American people? That's a question that's before us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
The gentleman yield.
We're out of time. I can go to Mr. Ivey, and I'm sure he'll yield you some time. Or I'm not sure, but I would bet.
Let me go first, and I'll
Well,
give you
just
time for
15 seconds.
All right, go ahead.
All right, thank the gentleman. The previous two speakers are concerned about me taking President Trump's comments out of context. This is exactly what they plan on doing if they can get their hands on this audio file. They want to take President Biden's comments out of context. So this is projecting. This is exactly what these Republicans are known for. They do it. That's what their big cheese does, Donald Trump. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I do want to
go ahead. I'll get time later.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's just not accurate. That's just not that's not our goal.
Well, I got to say, my colleague from Georgia raised the point about taking something out of context. There's certainly a concern about that, and I think it's a legitimate one. To not have the audio tape, but have the transcript, which again, nobody is actually alleged is incorrect in any way. It's not a verbatim transcript, that the person who took the transcript, violated her oath of office or his oath of office and taking the transcript. No allegations of that over there at all. So I think at this point, it's, you have to assume that it's factually accurate. But I had to get to this point though because I've got so many colleagues over there talking about the contrast. Biden wasn't prosecuted, but Trump was. But Herb sat right here. He issued a report that laid all of this out. But just to remind my colleagues that Herb pointed out the distinctions between Trump's case and Biden's case and said, quote, they are clear. There are serious aggravating facts in the Trump case. Most notably, after being given chances to return classified documents and avoid prosecution, Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, but he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then lie about it. And he goes on, in contrast, Mr. Biden turned in classified documents to the National Archives and Department of Justice, consented to the search of multiple locations, including his homes, sat for a voluntary interview, and in other ways cooperated with the investigation. That's the distinction. And that's a distinction that the Department of Justice draws frequently in making decisions about whether to move forward with a criminal prosecution. And, you know, the obvious fact that you guys are ignoring when you talk, well, it's a Democrat versus a Republican, former Vice President Pence was not prosecuted as well for the same sorts of issues for the same reasons. There's a reason Trump sits alone or will sit alone at this criminal trial that's upcoming. It's because he acted to obstruct justice. Biden and Pence did not. And I got to say this too, just along those lines, because there's sort of this ongoing claim that the Department of Justice is somehow biased and only going after Republicans. But you got a senator in New Jersey right now, a Democrat, who's about to start a jury trial. I don't know if they're still picking the jury or not, but they were last time that I looked. There's an indictment against a Democrat in Texas right now as well that just came down. It's a tough argument, really flies in the face of all of these open cases or cases that are moving forward to suggest that for some reason the Department of Justice is only targeting Republicans when it's clear they aren't. And then the last point that you all keep kind of avoiding, Her sat here and testified. You guys are making allegations today that you did not confront him with at the time. To the extent you raised it, he said, no, I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to protect the president. We're not trying to slant anything. I did this. I called the balls and strikes as I saw them. And, you know, I think it's a bit of a smear to sort of suggest otherwise. And it's a little unfair to do it now when he's not here, when you had the chance to do it when he was here. And, you know, I don't know, it's kind of frustrating to me. The Judiciary Committee is supposed to be about upholding the rule of law. And I know there are political issues, it's a presidential year and all of that stuff, but you're deliberately distorting the facts over and over and over again. And it really should stop. It really should. And then just one final point on these issues. The Attorney General here, Merrick Garland, 92,000 pages that he's produced over and over, presented witnesses to the committee that other AGs would have refused to permit, especially, you know, lawyers who were in the middle of a criminal investigation or a pending trial. Although you all are ignoring that and trying to act like he's obstructing justice, even though you got the verbatim transcript of the statement that he gave. With that, my time's expired and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I'll just respond briefly. Our motivation is exactly what I said 5 minutes ago. Is this the impartial administration of justice by the Justice Department? It's nothing else. That's our objective. That's our goal. And the best way to figure all that out is to get all the evidence. That's why I've asked for it. The gentleman from Maryland referenced when Special Counsel Hur was here. I did confront him. I laid out the same things. I know what asking. Did Joe Biden knowingly keep classified information? Yes. Did he knowingly release classified information? Yes. And why did he do it? Because he was writing a book. And how much did he get paid for the book? And he told me $8 million. So we laid all that out. We laid all that out in that testimony. So I did confront him.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
You confronted him with the facts those facts, but nobody said, you know what? You're not telling the truth. You're not charging him, and you should, because you're trying to protect him. None of you said that. Not one.
Of course I confront him with the facts. That's what you're supposed to do in these hearings. With that, I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me just say, I think you really encapsulated what this is about. You all are good at this. Seriously, I mean that as a compliment. You're really good at it. You're good at politics. Because again, we're speaking about the rally in Wildwood, which I happen to be in. As you probably know, that's in my district. I spoke at it. And by the way, you're probably feeling a little bad about it because we had 100,000 people that were from all walks of life, from plumbers to pipe fitters to professionals to engineers and architects and doctors to young people to old people. all excited to be there with 100,000 people. We had no incidents, nobody got drunk, nobody got hurt, there were no fights. It was a celebration of America. For an hour and a half, Donald Trump stood up there, mostly extemporaneously speaking about a whole bunch of stuff, having a little bit of fun, sometimes being sarcastic, sometimes being very serious and speaking about America and America freedom and what's happening to our borders, our cities, what's happening to our country in so many different ways that isn't good. But my point is, that's not what this hearing is about. So once again, and the chairman encapsulated it, you're leading us astray, you're good at it. We're getting into a debate about Donald Trump. You're damn good at it. But that is not what this is about. This is about that we have existing transcripts, and we want to know what the demeanor of the current president was. We know what the demeanor of Donald Trump was because you can watch the whole hour and a half on tape. You can look and see what he said, what he did. You don't even need to do anything. I wish we didn't have to have this hearing either. I just wish they turned it over. The chairman wouldn't, I will in a minute, the chairman wouldn't have called this hearing if simply they had said, yes, you can have the video recordings, you can actually check out his demeanor. The problem you have, as good at it as you are, the problem that you have is either that he is cognitively impaired and doesn't know what's going on and what he's doing, or he's not, and he knowingly took all this classified material out and then basically sold it to a ghostwriter to make $8 million. And I know you're in a tight spot, but that's the reality. And so we kind of want to know what it is, and so do the American people want to know what it is. They just want to know the truth. This isn't a big deal. Tell the truth. It sets you free, man. So you can go through this inside out over and over, and I know probably the next speaker on your side is going to have another amendment that's got to do with Donald Trump, but that's not what this is about.
Will the gentleman yield?
Focused on the ball. I will yield.
I hadn't planned on bringing up Donald Trump today. You did it. You're the one that came in and said, and tried to, say that Trump was mistreated because he's on trial, but Biden is getting a pass. You brought it up. I just went back to you.
Reclaim my time. No, what I brought up was that you all were we were taking our eye off the ball. We still are. We're into this discussion. Yeah. There's a real serious issue here. And by the way, they obviously don't think, since you brought it up, that Donald Trump's cognitively impaired because they're prosecuting him in different venues across the country, politically motivated. But I don't want to have that debate now, man. Mr. Ivey, I'd have that debate with you anywhere, anytime you want to do it.
If the gentleman,
I will yield back in a minute.
It's my time. If the gentleman yield back, the gentleman's done with yield back.
I will yield back.
Yeah, gentlemen, I would just point out the Jack Smith mishandled the evidence. We don't want to bring up Trump, but in that case, you got the prosecutor who seized the documents and changed the order that he seized the documents. The physical documents don't match up with the actual scanned documents. Some people might say that's tampering with evidence. That happened, and the judge down there said, wait a minute, we got to hold on here. What's going on? And of course, the irony is, Jack Smith mishandled documents while he's charging President Trump with mishandling documents. You can't make this stuff up. So I think in some ways, a reference to what's going on with President Trump is entirely appropriate. My time is up. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs then on the amendment from the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Ms. Sparks votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swallow? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Mr. Gooden votes no.
Clerk will record.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 12 noes.
The motion is not adopted. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Dean from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the
Wisconsin is reserved to point of order.
amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to.
Without objection, the amendment is read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania will explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to lay the table, and this builds on the amendment we just considered. The disinformation coming from the other side of the aisle is so troubling. It's funny, but it's really much more troubling than anything else. As we all know, Special Counsel Hur was not called in to do some sort of a competency hearing. He was to find out whether or not President Biden would be charged for mishandling of documents. I refer you to Mr. Hur, Special Counsel Hur's report here. We have every page of it. I forget how big it is here. Hold on, it's 350, 60 pages. Line 1, page 1. This is Special Counsel Hur's finding. And he said here to us, seated right at that table, that this was after, quote, rigorous, detailed, and thorough analysis by him and his group, his staff. Sentence 1, page 1. We conclude that no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. And then I thought very interestingly, and I even asked him to read this to us. The exception is former President Trump. I'm reading from page 11. Again, rigorously, thoroughly reported here by Special Counsel Hur in his conclusive findings. The exception, meaning that one person, one president, has been charged in misuse of classified documents. Page 11. It is not our role to assess the criminal charges pending against Mr. Trump, but several material distinctions between Mr. Trump's case and Mr. Biden's case are clear. You'll remember I asked Special Counsel Hur to read this. Unlike the evidence involving Mr. Biden, the allegations set forth in the indictment of Mr. Trump, if proven, would present serious aggravating facts, as my colleague read also. Most notably, continuing in the report, after being given multiple chances to return classified documents and avoid prosecution, Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, but he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then lie about it. End quote. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why do my Republican colleagues need this audio file at all? After all, DOJ has provided 92,000 documents. It's plenty to go through, including the transcript, and let me hold that up, 2 days worth of testimony, the transcript of the president cooperating in the 2 days following the attack in Israel on October the 7th. But this president, this sitting president, cooperated fully and completely. Every word of his testimony is reported here. Do you think the Republicans really want to listen to the president's vocal tone, pace, inflections, verbal nuance, and other idiosyncrasies? I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. It may be they want to do that, but not but only because they think they can manipulate President Biden's voice to make it the next Trump for President ad. After all, they've done it before. Take a look. March 2020, Trump's White House social media director posted and Trump retweeted an edited video that cut off President Biden's sentence to make it sound like President Biden was endorsing Trump. Later that year, Steve Scalise shared an edited video of President Biden that falsely made it appear that he was supporting defund the police. And back in 2019, President Trump and Rudy Giuliani both retweeted a manipulated video of Speaker Pelosi that had been doctored to make the Speaker appear incompetent. Unfortunately, we know that our chairman, our very chairman, has taken part in these phony manipulations too. I have to admit to you, as a mother and a grandmother, this next example hurts the most. Last year, Ms. Nina Jankowicz testified in her deposition that Chairman Jordan actually tweeted a manipulated video of her that contributed to a deluge of death threats against her. She was 8 months pregnant, while strangers online called her a Nazi and told her she should die. She had to attend her
Will the gentlelady shall suspend for a second?
I will not yield.
I'm not asking you to yield. We are citing a deposition. I have a point of order. There you go. The gentlelady.
I ask you to
Yeah, it's 40 seconds.
restore the clock.
Yeah, I have a point of order. You are citing a deposition in your amendment that has not been released in violation of House rules.
Let me check with my team.
Yeah.
I'll make the point that they should release the deposition.
Yeah, we're happy to release it.
And she should
All
be
right,
able
then
to
it's
quote it.
decided. They're happy to release the deposition. I ask for thank you for restoring my time.
We have to strike the language that is citing the deposition that has not been released by House rules.
Because you don't want to release it? You don't want to release what Mr. Jordan did?
I can't release it in real time.
I think you could. Ask the chairman.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
Can the chairman make a point of order? If so, then who rules whether the point of order is in order or not? No, the point of order is made by the chairman.
I can make a point, sua sponte, make a point of order. I'm in charge of enforcing the rules.
On your own point of order?
Yes.
Can someone else be heard on the point of order?
May I speak to the point of order? No?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, the sitting chairman of this committee knows that this transcript was from last April. The committee has every ability and has awesome time to have released that. It seems to me and this side of the aisle that it is trying to be withheld in order to protect the chairman from something quite embarrassing. I ask that it be released today.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Hold on.
I sure will.
Hold on.
Okay.
That requires consultation with majority and minority counsel, and the fact that you wish that it was released prior to that does not supersede the fact that a cited deposition that has not been released by this committee is cited in the amendment that is in violation of House rules.
Is the irony visible to anyone else here? Anybody else notice the irony here?
Mr. Chairman,
Objection.
Release the
Mr.
deposition.
Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
You've got the whole transcript here, and you're afraid to.
Gentleman will state his inquiry.
What precisely in the amendment are you objecting to?
Just the content, the quotation.
Which quotations?
Page 2. You can just quote. Free to release it tomorrow.
That's a decision for you all. The quotations in 2 and 3. Page 2 and 3.
The quotation that reads, question, so it is fair to say the 1 minute video that Mr. Jordan linked to
Yes,
just made it
that's the
sound,
quotation.
let me finish.
Right.
Just made
I
it
know
sound
what
like you were
everybody knows.
endorsing.
Objection, Mr. Chairman.
Correct?
Objection.
Gentleman is out of order.
As a minute.
Objection.
Gentleman is out of order. Gentleman will suspend.
So Mr. Jordan relied on this kind of...
Gentleman is out of order. The gentleman will suspend.
Who is out of order?
You are, Mr. Knight.
I made a parliamentary... Why am I out of order? What am I violating?
You're disclosing the content of the deposition that has not been released by the House.
It's disclosed in this amendment that's already been published publicly.
Which is the entire point of the parliamentary inquiry.
Well, then I'm happy to amend my amendment to take out only the Q&A that you do not want revealed. Because the chairman would be embarrassed by it. I will.
Is there
take that
objection? Yeah.
Wishful
Take it
thinking.
out of the record. Thank you.
On the point of order.
I want to be heard on the point of order. She's disclosed all this, she being Ms. Jankowicz, in interviews on multiple
That doesn't matter.
occasions.
I mean, her testimony towards that versus the transcript of the deposition are not the same. Disclosure.
Well, but the point there is, and I think the author of the amendment offered to strike the exact quotes, but the substance of the statements is public information.
Yeah. The amendment discloses committee record that has not been released in violation of House rules.
Well,
How
but
about my amended amendment? I'm taking out the testimony which this committee, the majority on the committee, does not want revealed. And I guess I don't even want to ask, can we get the audio of that?
I mean, if you look at the footnotes, Mr. Chairman,
Will the
cites-
gentlelady ask for unanimous consent to amend the amendment?
I ask for unanimous consent to amend the amendment to take out the language that you don't want revealed. Take out the Q&A.
Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank you. I think I had 40 seconds, but I'll take 30. Again, the irony is just extraordinary in this committee. Misrepresentation, a finding of incompetence by the former president, when you know this special counsel found. We conclude no criminal charges are warranted in this matter. It is absurd that the chairman of this committee, who sits in offense to his own subpoena, hundreds and hundreds of days, is seeking the voice of the president, whose voice he knows very, very well. The testimony is rich and complete. I ask that my amendment be considered and be honored and passed, because otherwise we could see the use of this audio, excuse me, to be doctored, to be deep-faked, and to be Trump ads. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment. Thanks so much.
Anybody else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Virginia.
I'm hesitant to speak because
Can't hear you.
I'm hesitant to speak, Mr. Chairman, because I'm so stunned by the amendment proposed by the gentlelady to get around House rules to disclose documents that have not been released by this committee. Is that how we're going to play now? Is that how the other side is going to play? Because that violates not just House rules, but general rules of decorum, general rules of decency. I mean, this committee has been a respected body in this Congress and many previous Congresses for many years. And one of the things that it emphasizes is not just the rule of law, but the balancing of the branches of government. When the executive branch overreaches its authority and says, we don't have to hand over these tapes to the legislative branch of government, we should be united in saying, how dare you? We should be united in saying, we represent the people. We are entitled to these tapes. we ask for them, we should get them. And to not just say no, but to say, to hell with your request, and to hell with House rules, and to hell with decorum, we're gonna make a mess of the rules that have been followed by this committee and many others for years and years is just offensive. So I oppose this. I'm going to reluctantly, well, the gentlelady's amendment is I'm going to oppose the amendment, but the way in which she went about her amendment, I'm going to strenuously oppose. I yield back.
Ranking members recognized.
Thank the gentleman. I want to point out two things. One, the striking hypocrisy of the majority in opposing this amendment, which simply reveals some records, while demanding the release of an audio tape of information that's already been released by transcript. And we know that in the past, the chairman of this committee has doctored audio tapes to make them say what they didn't in fact say. This amendment points this out. And I would also point out that even if the quotes are taken out of this amendment, which has happened, and whether or not this amendment passes, which it should, but in any event, this is all now on the public record, so you can't accomplish anything because it's out there. The hypocrisy, the dishonesty of the chairman is out there, revealed in the text of this amendment, whether it passes or not. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I just want to point out a couple of things. One is, with respect to the specifics here, in the footnotes, it's clearly public information. Footnote 5 is Jim Jordan's Twitter account. So it's not like we made this public. That was already made public by the chairman. Footnote number 2 is the letter from the Department of Justice. Footnote number 3 is an article from the Associated Press. So let's not get over the top here and start complaining about, deeply secret or confidential information that's out there. But I do want to say this too, to my colleague from Virginia. There's 115 plus transcripts from interviews that this committee's done that this committee's refused to disclose and make public. So we should do that. I mean, I hear all the statements today about, the public's right to know and we need the information. Let's do it. Put the information out, put out the 115. And then with respect to my colleague, I'll say this too, because this goes specifically to the conversation we had at our last hearing, where I requested email communications between House Republican majority and the departments and agencies that we keep dragging in to produce documents. I moved to request the information. That wasn't agreed to at the time. So this is not my time to yield, but look, if you want to get upset about her making a statement, my colleague from Pennsylvania, where it's public information, I think that's incorrect. And to say you're offended by it, I think is kind of over the line. But if we want to turn the page as a committee, and you all want to disclose this information and make it public, by all means, let's do it. And I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
I'll yield back.
Anybody seek recognition? Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it. I wanted to tell the rest of the story that is public knowledge about what happened as a result of these misleading narratives. Ms. Jankowicz, after these misleading narratives were spread about her, she received tens of thousands of death threats. You talk about decency and decorum, a manipulated video. You talk about decency and decorum here, my goodness. She had to go to court to obtain restraining order against the individual who had harassed her and repeatedly doxed her family. She was 8 months pregnant while strangers online called her a Nazi and told her that she should die. And she had to attend her prenatal appointments in disguise to avoid being recognized and harassed on the street. When a reporter reached out to Chairman I'll skip that part. Ms. Jankowicz encountered a staffer responding that Ms. Jankowicz was on the board's public face and should thus be held accountable in public. As you see, I'm taking out Mr. Jordan's role in any of this because he doesn't want anything to be known about his role in this, and I really want to honor that. In August of 2020, the current House Majority Leader shared an edited video that changed the words of a disabled activist and spliced clips together to falsely portray President Biden appearing to support defunding all the police, even though Biden has specifically said that the reforms being discussed were not the same as getting rid of or defunding the police. I want to just say that it is strange to hear from the other side of the aisle that they're worried about decency or indecency. They're worried about decorum. Please take a look in the mirror at your own members. What they do to spread disinformation and lies, to confuse the public knowingly, to say that this somehow, Mr. Special Counsel's report was about competency is so shameful. You know that's not what it is about. You just don't like the results of the report. The results of the report being, we conclude that no criminal charges are warranted in this matter against President Biden. You don't like that. You wish you could have had it another way because your own candidate is rightly facing charges. With that, I do have one unanimous consent. I asked to enter into the record just so that we can be more complete because the majority doesn't want to reveal the transcript of their conversation with Ms. Jankowicz. This is public reporting. The article is a surreal experience. Former Biden disinfo chief details harassment. It is from March 8th of last year, and it is Politico.
Without objection.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And members of this committee on the other side continue to repeat the falsehood that this hearing and this resolution is a part of an impeachment inquiry. Well, the last I heard about an impeachment inquiry by this do-nothing Congress after having spent $20 million in this committee investigating President Biden. The last I heard of an impeachment was by the chair of the other committee, the Oversight Committee, which has actually been the committee handling impeachment. And at that point, after they had President Biden's son in, Hunter, to testify and couldn't get anything out of him, the chair pretty much threw the towel in on, he threw in a white towel into the ring. And it was, gave up pretty much on impeachment. And now this committee is trying to drag it out of the garbage can and try to trick the American people into believing that this is a part of an impeachment inquiry. It is not. It's simply a expedition to try to make President Biden look bad in keeping with the report of Special Counsel Hur, who cleared President Biden, but nevertheless inserted some unnecessary and derogatory information in there that this committee has seized upon and continues to kick like a dead horse. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentlemen, back, who seeks recognition? Question is on the amendment. Clerk, all those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan. Mr. Issa. Mr. Gates. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Sparks. Ms. Sparks votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong?
No.
Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
How's Mr. Isa recorded?
Mr. Isa, you're not recorded. Mr. Isa votes no.
Mr. Tiffany?
Mr. Fitzgerald, you're not recorded. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no.
How's Mr. Tiffany recorded?
Mr. Tiffany's not recorded. Mr. Tiffany votes no.
How's Mr. Roy recorded?
Mr. Roy is not recorded. Mr. Roy votes no.
Mr. Gooden?
Mr. Gooden votes no.
Have all members voted? Clerk will record.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Reserve. Gentleman from Wisconsin's reserved a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. MAGA Republicans have spent $20 million this Congress investigating conspiracy theories and have nothing, absolutely nothing, to show for it. To date, MAGA Republicans have used this $20 million in taxpayers' money to hold 10 hearings before the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, 6 of which have been on the same topic. They have conducted 121 transcribed interviews or depositions with witnesses from over 24 different companies, nonprofits, or federal government agencies. They've spent 555 hours of staff and witness time in these transcribed interviews and depositions. They've sent more than 60 subpoenas to executive branch agencies and private entities. And they've solicited over 3 million pages of documents from executive branch agencies and private entities. And despite MAGA Republicans' reckless and irresponsible spending of American taxpayer dollars on their witch hunt quest to find incriminating information on President Biden and his administration, they've been repeatedly excoriated in right-wing media for not accomplishing anything this Congress. In fact, as recently as April 28, 2024, Fox News host Maria Bartiromo stated, quote, "I mean, look, with all due respect, people are sick and tired of congressional investigations that go nowhere. People are sick and tired of letters being written and sent to the people who we know are bad in the first place," end quote. This is from their own gallery of supporters. To date, there is no evidence of any impeachable offense committed by President Joe Biden. There is no evidence of misconduct in President Joe Biden's administration. MAGA Republicans' witch hunt will go down in history as a total and complete failure, especially when viewed in light of the fact that we're reduced now to seeking verification of an erroneous report about President Biden's mental acuity. While I do not support the underlying report, I think that if the committee refers it to the full House, it should at least be accurate. A key part of that accuracy is including the details of this protracted and over-the-top investigation in the background on the investigation section of the report recommending contempt. And for that reason, I urge you to support this amendment, and with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman withdraws a point of order. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The gentleman has asked also clerk vote. Clerk call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Ms. Sparks votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Shiapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivey?
Aye.
Mr. Ivey votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Point of order reserved by the gentleman from Virginia.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature.
Objection, the amendment be considered as read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
I object.
Okay,
It's brief.
Clerk will report. No problem.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with the subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary offered by Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania on page 3 after the paragraph ending, quote, when his son Beau died, unquote, insert. However, it is in fact false that President Biden could not remember when his son died. In the transcript of President Biden's interview with Robert Hur, President Biden clearly recalls the date of his son's death, saying, quote, what month did Beau die? Oh God, May 30th, unquote.
Young lady is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment corrects the record regarding the President's recollection of his own son, Beau Biden's death. And I saw in this markup today a welling up of decorum and decency and doing what is right. Just moments ago, you missed it, Mr. Chairman. And so I would think this will be an amendment that all of us can agree upon. It's an amendment about decency and facts and getting the record straight. As I pointed out when Mr. Hur was before us, President Biden clearly recalled the month and day his son passed. As on page 82 of the transcript, the complete transcript of his 5-hour deposition, he says, what month did Beau die? Oh God, May 30th, end quote. I find Mr. Herr's mischaracterization of that exchange in a government report to be inaccurate, grotesque, and gratuitous. That was nothing to do with the task he was given. It was just a free shot at a father grieving the grievous death of his son. Even more distasteful are Republican attempts to repeat that mischaracterization for political ends. Everybody in this room, everybody in this House must do better. But I suppose, you know what? Indecency is too often the point here. Finally, I'll note that in addition to his gratuitous and misleading statements concerning Mr. Beau Biden's death, Mr. Herr also determined on behalf of DOJ that President Biden would not be prosecuted for improperly storing sensitive documents, because in truth, the same cannot be said for Donald Trump. That's all the unrest on the other side. Mr. Trump remains the only former commander-in-chief to be criminally charged with endangering the service members he once led by leaving classified documents strewn around ballrooms and bathrooms and then hoping others would destroy or remove them. My amendment corrects the record on the important point of the president's searing memory of his own son's death, and I urge all members, those of decorum and decency, to support this factual correction. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, speaking of the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentlelady for making my point with her amendment. Not only did the transcript continue on after her amendment says May 30th, it continues, and I'll quote the transcript, with the question, was it 2015 when he died? I also thank the gentlelady for making the point that without the audio, we can't tell how much time passed between the question, what month did Beau die? And the words, oh God, the words May 30th, and how it was intoned, because he followed that with a question. Was, oh God, May 30th intoned as a question? We don't know because we don't have the recording. It's exactly why we need it. It's exactly why we've requested it over and over again, subpoenaed it, and now holding the Attorney General in contempt because he's not providing it, because we can't do our jobs for the American people accurately unless we have the most accurate information. And that's why we need the tapes, and that's why we're pursuing them, and that's why we're holding the Attorney General in contempt. So I oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you. That's an interesting explanation, but I gotta say, it's hard for me to figure out how the length of a pause between an answer and a question would have, you know, any kind of dispositive merit one way or the other. Let's just hypothetically say, okay, pause for 2 seconds, as opposed to 30 seconds. If it's 30 seconds, then it's an impeachable offense in some way. That somehow transforms this transcript into the basis for legislative action or some sort of impeachment, or even if you want to go there, because you guys have offered about 5 different versions of why you need this, none of which are based are included in the report that, at least the one that you passed out. But just say hypothetically, what does that prove? You know, the comments about the demeanor evidence, which I think are equally problematic, because again, I don't, nobody's asserting, and certainly Herr didn't assert that he thought Mr. Biden's answers were deceitful or disingenuous or anything like that. But, and you know, the issues that you all have raised as potentially the basis for impeachment of some kind have nothing to do with, you know, when his son died or not. So it's just hard to figure out where you're trying to go with this from a legitimate standpoint. Now, I'm not questioning anybody's integrity over there, but I mean, there is this sort of obvious alternative track where it would be, they want the audio tape so they can use it maybe not them personally, but somehow it might end up in a video, maybe a campaign video, maybe an election video that supports President Trump's effort to be reelected in his race against President Trump, Biden. You know, I got to say, it sort of makes more sense than the explanations I've heard from the other side. And, you know, the legislative purpose issue, which I really haven't had much of a chance to touch on yet, but we can do it now. The Supreme Court said one of the bases of oversight in seeking this information is there's a legitimate legislative purpose for getting it. And I'm not seeing the legitimate purpose that isn't served by the transcript. Because if you have the transcript and you have and it's a verbatim transcript, and as I said earlier, nobody over there is asserting that somehow the court reporter doctored it, fabricated it, did anything wrong with it, anything like that. As far as I know, nobody's made an inquiry with respect to the court reporter to ask her, you know, if she did something, you know, inappropriate. And certainly Mr. Herr, who came in here and testified, you could have asked him about that. He never said anything about a doctored transcript either. So I'm not seeing where you're going with this. I will.
Does the gentleman agree that the amendment is incomplete when it does not include the question that follows that statement of May 30th?
I mean, I don't think so, but I mean, she might be open to you offering an additional amendment to add language if you want. But the bottom line is, from the standpoint of at least having a fuller transcript, because there's no doubt that the way the report was written, at least the one that, I don't know what the final one's going to look like because we don't know, we don't have it yet, but it's about as one-sided a document as you can get. And so from the standpoint, and I'll say this again, because this is going to be the basis, we went through this on the Hunter Biden version of this as well. This is going to be what we send to the court, and I hope the Department of Justice does take this to court, because I want to see it litigated. I want to see a judge rule on this, because I think the majority is way over the line and the way it's abusing the authority here. But I'm really not seeing the reasoning behind why it's so critical to have the audio tape in a way that's not, you know, not addressed by the actual transcript, which again, nobody has questioned its accuracy. Nobody has questioned, you know, that it was doctored or in any way. Well, actually, somebody did sort of throw out that assertion on the fly, but there's absolutely no factual basis for it. Nothing, certainly, that was sustained by Mr. Herr, who again was here, testified, and y'all could have asked him about it, but nobody did. So, not saying anything about bad faith here, but the only explanation for why you all are making such a big deal about this is that you want the audio tape, and it might turn up in campaign ads down the road in the race for president. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from gentle lady from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentle lady requests a recorded vote. Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Isa? Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Ms. Spartz? Ms. Spartz votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa, Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Nagus, Ms. McBath, Ms. Dean. Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar, Ms. Ross, Ms. Bush, Mr. Ivy. Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Issa, you're not recorded. Mr. Issa votes no.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Gooden votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Point of order reserved by the gentleman from North Dakota.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment just to walk through it briefly. This goes to the issue of the distinctions between the case against Mr. Biden and the case against Mr. Trump. There have been multiple allegations today about, from the Republican side, that somehow the Department of Justice gave favorable treatment to President Biden. But I wanted to offer this amendment to make sure the record is clear, and also to make sure not just that the record of the discussion today is clear, but also that the report that ends up being sent forward, and I think is going to be the lead document if this gets to court, and again, I hope it does. But I think it balances out the one-sidedness, or helps to start and move it in that direction of the report that the committee has floated, the Republicans have floated. There are, on this point, Special Counsel Herr, who testified here and said this in the report as well. Several material distinctions between Mr. Trump's case and Mr. Biden's are clear. There are serious aggravating facts in the Trump case, most notably after being given multiple chances to return classified documents to avoid prosecution. Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, but he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then lie about it. In contrast, Mr. Biden turned in classified documents to the National Archives and the Department of Justice, consented to the search of multiple locations, including his homes, sat for a voluntary interview, and in other ways cooperated with this investigation. And the final point here, I think, is that unlike the deliberative acts of former President Trump to retain and conceal classified materials from the federal government, Special Counsel Herr found likely inadvertence and or mistake. And so we go on to quote some of the language from his report as well. We find the evidence as a whole insufficient to meet the government's burden of proving that Mr. Biden willfully retained the Afghanistan documents in the Virginia home in 2017. For other recovered classified documents, the decision to decline criminal charges was straightforward. The evidence suggests Mr. Biden did not willfully retain these documents and that they could plausibly have been brought to these locations by mistake. Unlike President Biden, Donald Trump intentionally and flagrantly took and concealed highly classified documents. Mr. Trump's actions are extremely serious and warranted the 32 counts of willful retention of the documents as he was charged. I want to say this as well, and I think I mentioned this earlier. Former Vice President Pence faced a similar factual scenario. There were documents found in, I believe, in one of his residences. Unlike Mr. Trump, Mr. Pence turned them over. He cooperated immediately. There was no evidence of any type of an effort to try and obstruct the investigation, hide the documents, or anything like that. certainly didn't ask anybody to move the documents for him, as Mr. Trump, I think this was raised in the indictment, had done. So I asked that this be included for the point of completeness. We want to make sure we send a document. I would oppose the whole thing, as I've stated repeatedly today, but if you're going to forward this document, at least send a document that has some semblance of balance to it, and I think shows the effort to try and present the court with a full take on information with respect to this particular issue. And as I mentioned earlier, this wasn't a place I was expecting to need to go today. I thought we were going to be focusing more on the specifics of, especially the executive privilege issue after it was asserted by the White House, and almost no discussion on the legal merits of that from the Republican side. And I guess with good reason. They don't seem to have a strong argument to address it. But since you brought this up, since you brought up the Trump contrast with Mr. Biden and sort of coupled it not only with allegations of misconduct by the overall Department of Justice, but specifically Mr. Hur, who I don't necessarily agree with everything he wrote, but I certainly am not going to sit here and essentially slander him for, trying to be unfair, tilting the system, trying to cover up for the president. None of that is merited, and I don't think there was anything about the report or his testimony that he presented here that would support that. So, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Strike through Ross, we're in opposition to the amendment, but it almost passively aggressively proves the point. This wasn't substantially similar to Vice President Pence. It wasn't substantially similar to Donald Trump. We have a 40-year history of keeping classified documents, 40 years. It's why the audio is important. He's reading classified documents to his ghostwriter, reading them to him. Like the dismissal, this isn't I've worked with the DOJ in an adversarial way, and you know what I've never seen for a regular defendant in criminal court? The DOJ making the plausibility defense over a 40-year history. And we talk about disingenuous and all of those things. If you spent 40 years robbing liquor stores, and then you cooperated with law enforcement, they're not going to charge you. That is a sentencing factor. That's an obstruction factor. That is a different factor. If you're going to the underlying offense of maintaining and disclosing classified documents, that is a significantly different thing. And only in this world would you go to that place where we'll say, hey, you committed the underlying crime, and you did it for 40 years, but you cooperated with us, so we're going to allow you to skate. That's the difference. You spend a lot of time talking about the obstruction charge, but we don't spend enough time talking about the egregious nature of the underlying maintaining and disclosing classified documents. Like, that's the difference. And that's the problem. And that's why audio matters, because the audio matters, and there's inflection, and there's different ways in which you do it. I mean, if you're telling your ghostwriter in a laughing matter that you are reading classified documents to him as he's writing your book, that's different than a lot of different ways in which you do it. And the transcript is all of that. But there is no other scenario. And by the way, I would have gotten into this with Special Counsel Prosecutor Hur, but we have the 5-minute rule, and I had a lot of other things to get out. But you can talk about the secondary part of this case all day long, but I don't think anybody who reads the report, looks at the nature, he did it when he was a senator, he did it over 45 years, he had been warned about it and continued to do it. You have to seriously jump through some hoops to get to the inadvertent part of it. And so you're talking about maintaining and disclosing classified documents. And if anybody thinks that the information in the Hur report doesn't give a valid reason for that occurred knowingly and willingly, then the question is, why wasn't it knowingly and willingly? And that's where we're at this point. So
but the gentleman
talk about obstruction. I'm going to yield to the gentleman, Mr. Benz.
Thank you. Just a question. If I recall correctly, when I asked Mr. Hur if his report exonerated the president, his answer was unequivocally no. Is this consistent with your thought?
Well, and absolutely, and we've heard that over the course of this whole thing. There is no claim of innocence. There is no finding of innocence. That is not how reports work. But we keep going past the underlying offense, which is the classified documents offense. And why wouldn't you cooperate? Like, why wouldn't you cooperate when you have the ability and knowing exactly how everything works through and where the differences lie? Yes.
Yes. So thank you for the yield. It just seems to me that Mr. Herr was saying we don't exonerate. What we're going to do is say that the president is an older gentleman who is incompetent, and we don't think we can get a conviction. Therefore, we're not going to prosecute. But to that point, I want to ask you as a federal prosecutor.
Oh no, as a defense attorney.
The best evidence rule. You can talk about that just for a moment, because I know it goes both ways lots of times. But is there any doubt in the world that the best evidence of what we're trying to get at here is the verbal recording?
There's a reason for the last 5 years in Congress, I have worked with my friends on both sides of the aisle to get to custodial interrogations being recorded by federal law enforcement. Take it completely out of this room and this political thing. And to be honest, oftentimes I fight with my side of the aisle on that issue more than I fight with your side of the aisle. The reason you want audio, the reason you want video, the reason you want those things is because it is without a doubt the best evidence that exists in which to overall deal with the issues that you're trying to incorporate. And if you want to talk about legislative purpose, as somebody who has been watching this happen from the minority and the majority for 5 years, there is the equal application of justice part of this answer. We have a guy that was prosecuted a year after he altered an affidavit in front of a court, and he's currently practicing law in Washington, D.C. right now. And so with that, I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The lady from Vermont's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Thank you. I just want to run through some of the statements that were just made a moment ago. I guess I can work my way backwards to some extent. With respect to the recording of statements, and I share the gentleman's view about the importance of the federal investigators recording statements, but I would make a couple of notes to that. The first is, for example, there are no videotapes of grand jury testimony, for example. They're all electronically transcribed by court reporters in the room. And nobody would argue, that I'm aware of, that that's not evidence sufficient for use in court, for use to charge for criminal purposes, for example, for false statements or perjury,
Would the gentleman
or impeachment. I will.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, because in that scenario, it's the best evidence.
Yeah, it's certainly sufficient for the basis for criminal charges. And with respect to scenarios where you have a transcript and a videotape, if the videotape, you can use the tape or the transcript for impeachment purposes or whatever. I mean, it's sufficient. So the point here, I think, though, given the nature of the proceeding, it's incumbent on you all to show that there's some additional evidence that you can get from a videotape that you can't get from the transcript. Yeah, you may give me the funny look, but that's what's going to be required. If this goes to court, we would have to justify a finding of contempt, because the burden would be on this committee to show contempt, right? So what's the difference between the transcript and the tape? And you talked about the lapses in time, and I just questioned a moment ago. I don't know how that gets you from, it's a 5-second pause, it's a 15-second pause. I don't know how that gets you from a statement to that's therefore impeachable or chargeable or anything along those lines, which is what's required. In the legislative purpose standard, I haven't heard a reason for how it's not satisfied by the verbatim transcript, which you've already been presented with. And there's no question about it being verbatim and accurate, based on what Mr. Herr said and based on the certification that this received at the time that it was recorded and printed. You mind if I yield to the gentleman from California? I yield to the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Ivey. And I think the point is, it's never going to be enough. Like, you guys are not doing oversight, you're doing overkill. And as soon as you get the audio, you're going to say, well, we wish there should have been a video. And then you'll get a video. And then you'll say, well, we wanted his health records. Like, well, who knows, like, if he, wasn't on some medication. that affected it. And then once you get that, you're going to say, well, there was not a polygrapher there. We don't know if he was telling the truth or not. You have been thoroughly, and I want to emphasize, thoroughly humiliated in your impeachment quest, which, by the way, is that happening? Is that dead? I pronounced it dead a couple weeks ago. Is it happening? I don't think it's happening. And so you're humiliated. And so you're digging and digging and digging and digging, and you just want more. But guys, it's not happening. You're not impeaching him. You have nothing. I just invite you to move on. Like, let's do something that actually helps people. Just move on. And we're never going to make you happy because you just don't accept him as president. And so we're wasting everyone's time by doing this exercise. And I yield back.
Would you yield for a minute?
I yield to Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. Mr. Abbey, I very much like Governor Armstrong and have been happy to work with him. Well, he's still been here, but he won't be here soon. But this whole thing was about whether or not the president, when he was the vice president, violated the law. Mr. Hur said he definitely took these documents. There's no question about that. But he couldn't get a conviction because he was a sympathetic character. So what good is it going to do if they get to hear him say he was a sympathetic character, and why they thought that? That's not the issue. The issue is, did he take the stuff or not? Hur said he took it. There's no question about it. He took the stuff, and for his biographer. And Jordan says motive and blah, 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 and indictment. It's about the fact he's a sympathetic character and you couldn't get a conviction. That's the issue. So we're off on rabbit trails. You should never get off on rabbit trails.
And just to sort of make a final statement here, the amendment I'm offering doesn't actually go to that. It just goes to the fact, the distinctions that Herb drew between Biden and Trump with respect to the mishandling of documents and the obstruction of justice that occurred afterwards. So I would hope that we can get a vote on the merits from my colleagues on the Republican side on that amendment.
Gentleman yields back, or gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
Chairman, am I recorded?
Ranking member.
Mr. Nadler, you're not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Klein votes no.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Gooden votes no.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Massey votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 8 ayes and 9 noes.
The amendment is not agreed on. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from California. Clerk will report. Point of of order reserved by the gentleman.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
Objection, the
substitute.
amendment will be considered as read.
I object, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with the subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary, offered by Mr. Swallow of California on page 6 at the end of the paragraph that begins, quote, to further the committee's constitutionally mandated oversight and legislative duties, end quote, insert a new sentence which reads, quote, however, taking into account that multiple members of this committee, including the chairman, remain out of compliance with subpoenas issued to them by another committee of the House of Representatives, no member of Congress will be permitted to vote to hold any other person in contempt of Congress until such time as they provide the testimony that has been required of them regarding their participation in the planning and execution of the events that took place on the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, end quote.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment plainly says that if you have not responded to your own subpoena, you can't bring a subpoena or seek compliance upon anyone else. In the law, we call it the unclean hands doctrine or the clean hands doctrine. It's a legal principle in common law that prevents a party from receiving relief from a court if they have acted unethically or unjustly in relation to the matter at hand. At our own home, it's called the wash your hands before dinner doctrine. And my 6-year-old and 5-year-old and 2-year-old, they're not coming to the dinner table until they themselves have clean hands. There are dirty hands on the other side. Multiple times, 2 members of this committee have been asked to comply with a subpoena related to January 6th. One of those members, I don't think is here today. I think he's up watching Mr. Trump's trial. But most simply, don't come at us about anyone else's compliance if you are out of compliance. And the chairman is 735 days, 17 hours, 19 minutes, and 24 seconds out of compliance of his own subpoena. And so this amendment would prohibit the chairman or anyone else from bringing compliance or contempt upon somebody for another matter. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Point of order being withdrawn. Gentleman from Virginia.
Speaking to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman and I thank the gentleman for his remarks. I've heard them a couple times. And in responding, I would just say that, first of all, the subpoenas for the members of this committee are no longer in effect because the last Congress has finished. We'll just make that point first. But we also want to look at the responses that were made by the chairman to the January 6th committee. The chairman never declined to testify. The chairman, in fact, wrote every time he was asked to testify and responded with further requests for either statements or further requests for responses from the committee, and never received any responses from the committee. Never expressed an unwillingness to testify. So the characterization that he refused is inaccurate. And it's clear that Democrats were subpoenaing Republicans for political reasons at the time. Chairman Thompson stated that he pursued these subpoenas in part to, quote, weaken Republicans if they took the majority in the future. And so we see through the political motivations of those who issued the subpoenas to begin with and those who want to make it a political point now. So I oppose the amendment and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleague from Virginia, yes, we've had this discussion before, but just a couple quick things to clarify the points you just made. The first was, yes, there was an exchange of correspondence between the chairman and the committee. The problem was the chairman made, in my view, demands that were unusual, to say the least, in response to a subpoena, like, tell me how you're going to use the information and give me the information that you have about my this related to my testimony in advance of me coming. In other words, he wanted discovery before he showed up to give the statement. Now, let's compare that to what we've got before us with respect to the Department of Justice. And in this particular instance, not only has there been substantial compliance with respect to, I wish I had it in front of me, the number of subpoenas and document requests, and I remember it's 92,000 pages of documents. I think it's like 40 witnesses from the Department of Justice, and as I mentioned earlier, some of those witnesses were prosecutors in, mid-investigation, who the department still produced for statements and transcripts here before the committee, which I think is totally inappropriate and actually potentially interferes with the legitimate prosecution efforts by the Department of Justice, ironically in one instance with respect to Hunter Biden. So, let's be clear about that piece. And then as I mentioned earlier today, if we're going to stay on the substantial compliance standpoint, just in this particular request, there was a report generated by Mr. Herr that the department was not required to turn over, but Mr. Garland decided to turn it over anyway on his own initiative. With respect to the transcript, again, there's no statutory requirement that he turned that over, but he did turn it over. And he made Mr. Herr available to testify, and Mr. Herr, he resigned right before he gave the testimony, which was fine, but it's clear that the department was not trying to block him providing testimony to this committee. So from the standpoint of substantial compliance, this is an outstanding record for the Department of Justice. Now, I won't go into the contrasting point that Mr. Swalwell made. I think he laid it out pretty good. But let's be clear about this. The compliance we've had here, I think, has been really extraordinary. The executive privilege claim, which was raised by the department, again, really has not been addressed, certainly not on the legal merits by the Republicans in this committee. And as I mentioned earlier today, I have a letter that was dated May 1, 2019 from the Bar Justice Department to Mr. Nadler, who was the chairman at the time, raising basically most of the same points that we're talking about today. Now, with respect to the chilling effect issue, which you all sort of poo-pooed a few minutes ago, similar access by the department could be impeded in future investigations if the White House were given reasons to believe that Congress would receive each and every document shared with the department. Now, this is Barr's department objecting to turning over documents where there was no predicate provided already. In this instance, you've got the transcripts, you just want additional information. As Mr. Swalwell said, apparently, you'll never get enough. And then the Bar Department of Justice said the committee has not articulated any legitimate legislative purpose for its request for all of the special counsel's investigative files. This is for the Mueller report. The committee has no legitimate role in demanding law enforcement materials with the aim of simply duplicating a criminal inquiry. Now here, the Merrick Garland Justice Department gave you the transcript, gave you the report, gave you the lawyers to testify about what they'd done. Barr objected to all of it with respect to the Mueller report, raised the same sorts of issues. Now, those have been addressed in a different forum. But here, you guys are ignoring the compliance that's been provided by the Department of Justice over and over and over again. I'm running out of time, but my point here is that you've got substantial compliance from the Department of Justice. Mr. Chairman, the record is what it is. I think we've discussed it before on multiple occasions, and Mr. Swalwell's raised it as well, but I think it's a contrast that bears noting in this particular instance, especially where we're seeking contempt against the Attorney General of the United States. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia for unanimous consent.
Ask unanimous consent to insert into the record 3 letters from you to Chairman Thompson, dated January 9th, 2022, May 25th, 2022, and June 9th, 2022.
Objection. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, please.
Gentleman asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Isa? Mr. Gates?
Thanks, Ben.
Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Nagus? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Chairman, there are 9 ayes and 12 noes.
Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.